Hi, friends. Welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. This is John, and before we dive in, I want to let you know that you have until Friday at midnight to invest in our public crowdfunding campaign at WeFunder, where we are raising investment funding. You can join over 500 people who have invested some over $2 million in AEA at this point. So, want to invite you to participate in that if you are so inclined. It's going to be a lot of fun here at AEA the next couple of years, and we want to welcome our farming community to be a part of that. So thank you all to you who've invested so far. I've been looking forward to the conversation today for quite some time. I've met Brian Magarin a couple times at a couple of different conferences. We had several very interesting conversations, and I get asked the question quite regularly about how is it possible for us to farm without Roundup? How is it possible for us to farm without glyphosate? And there is this kind of this perception that if we want to grow crops on a broadacre commercial scale, then doing so without Roundup while maintaining yields is just a non-starter. And I don't believe that that's the case. And Brian is one of the examples for why I believe that to not be the case. But I'll let you hear directly from the man himself. Brian, thank you for being here and for agreeing to share your experiences. Tell us a little bit about the context of your operation and your journey, what you've been working on, and where you are now.
Well, thanks for having me, John. I appreciate the opportunity here. I've been farming for about 24, 25 years now. Started out in the conventional world, moved over into the organics about 12, 13 years ago now, and then slowly been moving into the regenerative side more and more. Just seeing the problems that we're using with conventional agriculture and the chemistry and that sort of stuff. And it seems like we're just putting more and more and more on our fields, and that's not a good thing. So with the organic side, and I guess kind of started in the non-GMO side first, which led into the organic, kind of got the ball rolling, and it just never stopped. So but now I had my own operation, was running about 3,000 acres of organics, and now I've kind of transitioned into a different role, managing a farm for Belltown Farms here in South Central Nebraska. So we're managing about 9,000 acres underneath this operation, and then still doing some of my own on the side.
And for those of our listeners not familiar with that region and context, what does that mean from a rainfall and soil and management perspective, and what types of crops are you farming?
Most of what we're farming is corn and soybeans is mostly common to the area. Our rotations, corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa is in the rotations what we do. We've got also a bunch of cereal grains that we grow for cover crops and that sort of stuff, and then obviously using covers in between all of our conventional crops. Rainfall, that's a moving target for us. The National Weather Service actually was in contact with them last fall, and they told us that our area here in Southwest Adams County was actually as dry as what it's been in the 1930s in the last recent years. So 2000, I believe it was 2019 or 2020, we received 47 inches of rain throughout the growing season. And
Wow.
I don't think we've received 10 inches since then. So
Wow.
we've had the what you would call the extremes from one end to the other, that's for sure.
And that pattern is becoming, or that none pattern is increasingly becoming a pattern across many parts of North America, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If it wasn't for irrigation in our area right here, it would be a desert. So irrigation is saving us and keeping everything green and keeping everything afloat in our area, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, as you started going through the transition of first looking at non GM crops and then into organic certification, how did your cultural management practices evolve? And I think one of the pieces that you've become very well known for is your effective weed control. What does that system look like for you today?
Well, today it's a lot of cover crops. That's what we rely on for most of our weed control. I always say that every year I shoot for 100% no-till. Now, obviously, in the management role that I'm in right now, it's a little bit different. But on my personal farm, that's what we've always shot for is 100% no-till or organic no-till every year. And then we let Mother Nature determine what percentage that's actually going to be. If she helps us out and we get some timely rains and the covers grow as they should, then we might be 100% no-till that year, and use the regenerative practices of roller crimping and those types of practices. But then on some years where we have a real late and cool season, we still have to play the insurance game in this world, for crop insurance. So we're kind of pushed up against those planting dates, which is always an issue. And sometimes we have to go back to more conventional ways or conventional tillage in order to get things up and going. So it really just depends on the year. Going back, I guess the big push for us is when I started in conventional farming, using chemicals and that sort of stuff. I was coming out of alfalfa, so I was used to not using or using much of any fertilizers or chemistries because the alfalfa kept the ground covered 100% of the time. And then when the dairy crunch came in, that kind of pushed the alfalfa industry out of our area, just because all the dairies went under or were joined and had multiple dairies become one big dairy instead of all the little dairies. So that became an issue for us, and that kind of pushed us into the conventional world. I started out with no-till, and I guess no-till in our area means you just don't till. It doesn't mean you put cover crop. It doesn't mean anything else. It's just you plant, you spray, and you harvest. And our issue is we don't get enough wintertime moisture to deteriorate that crop residue that's out there. And so it just kept more. We'd have places that we'd have drifts of 8 to 10, 14 inches of crop residue left over from corn crops. And we tried strip till. We went from no till to strip till to try to do that. Well, then all that did was just pile it up into bigger piles in between the rows. Then when the wind would blow, like it usually does here in Nebraska, usually 20 plus mile an hour is a decent breeze for us, or a slight breeze, I guess is the way I should say it. Um, we'd get everything pushed out of the way with the strip till machine. Well, then, by the time we come back a few days later or, a couple of weeks later with the planter, it would just blow everything back shut. And so we'd have to push it back out of the way again. Well, if the wind would blow before the corn came up, now our corn had to come through, 8 to 10 inches of residue, and we were just losing stands, and it was just a mess, one thing after another. After that, we switched into actually completely full tillage. We went back in with the ripper, opened the ground up. We had tremendous ground compaction. We had some farms that were no-till for, I'd say, close to 15 years. And when we went through them with a ripper, we couldn't hardly pull them. The ground, the compaction was terrible on them just because there was no living roots. It was just, corn crop, soybean crop, corn crop, soybean crop. It wasn't actually true, what I would call true no-till. But after that, once we got into the tillage, well, then when we got into the tillage, we realized, hey, we don't need all the chemistries, because we were removing our pre-emerge chemistry with a tillage pass. It was actually saving us money, and it was actually increasing yields. But then we were working with a fertility company out of eastern Iowa, and their big push was the non-GMO crops, and using non-GMOs and getting away from fungicides and getting away from pesticides and all the stuff that we were spraying every year. And that's really what kind of got the ball rolling. And that was about 2009 for us. We were only really into the heavy chemistry for about 2 to 3 years. But then once we got into that, we started working with higher fertility rates, and playing more in the fertility side to see if we could increase yields. But in the back of my mind, it was always, well, what is the baseline? That's always an issue of where is ground zero. If we don't do anything, where do we end up at? Is 0 0? Is that what it is? Or is 0 100 bushel? Nobody knows unless you actually do it. So we did some testing with some, excuse me, with some narrow rows and high populations, high fertility. And then what we were doing just run of the mill stuff of 2000, early 2010 era, of, normal crops and fertility rates. And then we started cutting back 50%, 75% cut rates. And the crazy thing is when you looked at the yields, of course, the yields fell off. But when you started looking at the ROI of it, of what you were putting in versus what you were getting out, the less we raised, the more money we made. I mean, it was the exact opposite of what everybody, every co-op around, and what everyone said was going to happen is what was happening. And at the end of the day, the books is what tells the story. Sure, I can't go to the coffee shop and brag that I'm raising 350 bushel corn, but I can tell you that I have the most profitable acres. I can tell you what acres on my farm are the most profitable. Excuse me, because of that. Sorry, I've been fighting the cold for the last couple of weeks. So
I hope you get better soon. No need to apologize. So what did you discover your baseline to be when you backed off your fertilizer application rates by 75% or by 50%? Did you try any at zero? What was your baseline?
Well, at zero, we were dropping. Normal for us is around, I would say, 200 pounds of nitrogen. Give or take, you could plus or minus 20 pounds. We could drop down to 150 pounds of nitrogen on soybean stubble and still raise a 220, 230 bushel crop. That was pretty common for us. But when we started cutting back, I cut back to 100 pounds of N. And honestly, the first year or so, we didn't see hardly any any drawback. We cut all the way back to zero on some of it and started working with biologicals. And, we seen that flip, of yields where we did absolutely nothing. We were shooting, I'd say in that 100 bushel range, 110 bushel range with zero inputs, as far as the fertility wise. But we kind of based some of that off of residual of what we had for nitrogen left in the soil, just depleting that nitrogen down. But when we started switching into organics, that's really kind of what we seen. We started to add in manures and that sort of stuff, but it seemed like everything we added, we were always fighting the new weed. Where it's like, well, we would add manure, well, then we'd start fighting pigweeds, and we'd start fighting this, or we start fighting that. Well, then we get those under control, and then the next weed would come along of sunflowers or water hemp, or it would just seem like it was one right after another that we were fighting, and that we were working with cover crops at that time. And really, I can't say that we went to complete zero, because we started putting the cover crops in to work, to start to counteract the adverse effects that we were seeing, and the cover crops started changing the soil and started making things better. So, to say that we actually went all the way to zero, I don't know if I actually got there. We went the other way. We went as high as 300 pounds of nitrogen, 80,000 seeds per acre, high fertility, high population corn, and grew some tremendous yields. Yields that I guarantee you'll probably never see again in this area. It's a great thing when the combine bin's running over and you're not even to the pivot point yet. And normally you're going all the way through the field. So, and I've got a couple of guys that I don't know if they'll ever listen to podcasts or not, but they might know and they could back me up on that. It was an amazing thing to see, but at the end of the day, there wasn't any more money in that, high population, high fertility corn than what we seen in the 50% range of fertility. And now what we're seeing with the organics and the regenerative and working on that side of stuff, it's the ROI is what matters. It doesn't, bushels per acre don't pay bills.
Yeah. So you made a comment a bit ago when you were talking about cover crops, that the cover crops started changing their soils, and of course they start contributing nutrient release into the system, and that's why you never got to zero. And one of the conversations that you and I were group conversations that you and I were participating in at a conference this last winter, you made a comment that really caught my ears. You said something to the effect of, I make money with my cover crops and I lose money if my cover crops don't do well. I might be paraphrasing a little bit here. Can you elaborate on that? What were you describing?
Well, and in our area for organics is what I was really going into. Our biggest issue is fertility. We're a long ways away from the chicken barns. We got a lot of cattle manure in our area, but cattle manure is not nitrogen. I mean, it's you got your phos, you got everything else in there, but you don't have true N, which is something that we do require or is needed in a way. So our cover crops can grow as much fertility as what we can go out and buy. And we've used vetch in the last few years, 6, 7 years now. We've used vetch and alfalfa and clovers and that sort of stuff, legumes, and we've raised 200, 200, 210, 215 pounds of nitrogen, and had cover crops that looked are 5, 6 foot tall when we were planting into them. Actually, my screensaver on the other computer here is one of them that we're dragging, and you can't even see the planter bar behind the tractor because it's being encompassed by the cover crop that we're planting into. And on those years when we had that plentiful cover crop, that diverse cover crop out there, that produced everything for us, and we didn't have to have all the logistics of bringing in that fertility from hundreds of miles away in our case. um,
So when you say that produced everything for you, obviously you had the quantity of nitrogen that was needed there in the cover crop residue. But what does the release curve of that look like? Did the cover crop residue release nitrogen in time for the cover crop? Was there enough for the cover, or excuse me, for the crop? Was there enough for the corn crop throughout its entire lifetime? And what did that translate to in terms of actual yields?
what we seen was, I wish we had a pop-up, just something right away, because we planted in and we did some studies a couple of years in a row, about 3 years in a row, of planting in or planting green prior to it being roller crimped, and then planting in after it was roller crimped. When we roller crimped prior to planting, it released obviously sooner, and we seen the corn seem to do better. But as far as ease of planting into, and I would say longevity of the cover crop was actually better. We got a better kill where we waited about 4 to 5 days after we planted before we actually roller crimped. That seemed to work better because what we've seen, and especially in vetch and the alfalfas that we've messed in, um, the it's like when you drive through it with the planter, it's like it stresses the crop. It stresses that cover crop, and it actually causes that crop to flower more. Well, when it flowers, it's reproductive. When it's producing nodules at that time, and it seems like it produces more when you can stress it right at that right stage or that last stage of its life.
That makes
And
sense.
then when you roller crimp it, it actually kills better on the vetch side because it's more, it's further along in its maturity state, and you have more flowers out there, and it crimps a lot easier. Um, and as far as yield, I mean, our best yields, we've had 5,000, 5,000, 5,500 pound popcorn on what I would call zero inputs. The only
Wow.
input was that vetch. Now we've also had 1,500 to 2,000 pound crops on that where the vetch just wasn't as good. And we tried it. We just didn't have enough cover, and we had to end up going back in and, supplementing that fertility. So it's not perfect, but if you have the opportunity to grow it, oh my goodness, it will absolutely produce. And I would say the most important thing to this, and if you talk to anyone that's ever grown cover crops, it's that fall. It's the work the previous fall. You've got to get it in time. If you want to double crop soybeans behind wheat, if that doesn't work. This is a crop that needs to go in behind wheat or behind a cereal. It needs to go in first part of September, late August, first September. It needs to go in, and it needs to get a good root and get established, because that will produce. Every time, every single year that we've done that, we've had tremendous luck with it. Now, the years that we've pushed that, If you have a wet spring, but a warm wet spring, you can get by with pushing it a little bit later just because that crop comes out of dormancy earlier. But it just seems like if you push that into first part of October when you're planting those clovers and that vetch, by
Yeah.
the time they come out of dormancy in our area, it's too late. They just don't have enough time, and the weeds are just as just as aggressive as what the cover crop is, and it just doesn't seem like it works. But when you do your due diligence and you make sure that you do it correctly, so far it's been success after success, but it's where we've pushed that envelope. That's where we've had our what I wouldn't call a failure, but I'd call an unsuccessful attempt. It's where we've pushed that envelope, and it's still warm this fall. We'll be okay. But when you don't have growing degrees, you just don't have growing degrees.
Yep. When you mention the possible benefits of a row starter, there is a company that makes organic and regenerative row starters that could give you a nice pop up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Um, I mentioned that because I find it interesting. I spoke at a conference in Saskatchewan this last winter, and out of 150 people, six of them had not listened to the podcast, and most of them did not know that a company was associated with the podcast, which is, on one hand, it's a good thing because I'm not here to be an infomercial, but to share and to help share other people's stories. But on the other hand, it was an intriguing dynamic as well. I've perhaps done too good of a job.
Well, I'd say
Um,
you've done a good job in that aspect. So, yeah.
um, when with this whole cover crop dynamic, needing to get it established early, planted early, and then get it really taking off aggressively in the spring. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that the years when the cover crop doesn't work so well is when you bump up against the required planting dates. Because the cover crop isn't large enough yet and hasn't matured yet to a point where it's an effective weed control, or where it's providing the quantity of fertility that you need. Tell us a little bit more about that dynamic and what is the what are the drivers in those determining those planting dates, and is there any opportunity to get flexibility there in the future?
I hope there is. I've been in touch with people at the RMA Federal Crop. I've spoke with all the local insurance companies and pushed as much as I can push, and I think it's you know it, some of them that you talk to, they say, well, just get a written agreement. Well, it's hard to get a written agreement, in every single case, because some insurance agents will push a lot harder to help you, and some just, they can easily sell thousands of acres of crop insurance, so they don't care, to help you out. I think it's going to have to be a push, from the regenerative side of things. Maybe some politicians. I'm not for sure where that's going to come from, but I think a lot of us that have met at these conferences the last few years that are doing the same style of farming with roller crimping and that, which is approved practice by the insurance industry. But I think there's just a misunderstanding on their part that it can be done by the calendar, not by the crop condition. And it's the crop condition that determines when those dates are. And what I've seen is we've planted corn, uninsurable corn, into the 15th to 20th of June, thinking, well, this is going to be we're not going to make this work. It's past our June 5th is our late planting date. That's our cutoff. And we planted, like I say, the 15th to the 20th, and have had no yield loss comparison to stuff that went in May, just because your growing degree days, you're hitting the peak of the growing degree. That corn goes in the ground's 65, almost 70 degrees. It comes up in a matter of a couple of days. Some of it, I swear, it comes up in hours.
I
I
have
mean,
I
it,
have seen corn
it
emerge in less than 24 hours.
yeah, and especially when you're dealing with cover crops. The summer that I talked about that we had 47 inches of rain, we actually would not have been able to plant. We probably would have had failed acres that year had it not been all in cover crop, because we were planting into green cover crop that was 5 foot tall. And we actually planted, and one of my neighbors, that one of the conferences we were at, he was actually riding with me. And while we were planting, we received an inch of rain while we planted a quarter of corn. And that corn was some of the best corn that we had. And it was raining as if we were running the windshield wipers on high to keep it going. And we had no buildup of mud on the planter. Every now and then we'd plug the closing wheels, but that was a design flaw by yours truly. I had built the closing wheels myself, and I didn't allow enough area. And and the problem was, is we were actually picking up turnips and radishes, and it was plugging the closing wheels. It wasn't the cover crop, and it wasn't the muddy conditions. It was actually the that. But the planter was clean, and Brian can back me up on that. When we'd get out and dig it out, and the only reason why we had any mud on our hands is because the closing wheels plugged up. So it was kind of crazy. And
That's a remarkable anecdote to be able to continue planting in the rain.
yeah, we just floated, and the tractor never got muddy. It was the craziest thing you ever seen. My agronomist was there that day and seen what we were doing, and we sent him a couple of pictures and photos and made him drive over there. And he says, it's going to turn, like concrete. It's going to, everybody said that's going to be the worst stand of corn you're ever going to see. And it ended up being one of our best, because when we laid that cover crop, because we were planting into standing cover crop, then we roller crimped it about 2 days later. So that, the cover crop is what we were floating on. There was probably 3 inches of cover crop underneath of us the entire time we were planting. And you can't pack soil that has green living plants on it.
And
You
that
can
has
leave it
roots in
packed,
it.
but it's got living roots. It's going to open that soil right back up.
Yeah,
And
it's the roots in the soil that are equally or maybe more important than the residue that's on the soil surface.
yeah, yep, the residue on the soil allowed us to plant into the muddy conditions,
Right.
but the roots underneath the soil allowed us to not have the compaction. And I think when we got all said and done that time, I think we were dropping 37,000 seeds per acre. And the final plant, we were like 35,000 final plant. I mean, it was just as good, if not better, than the stuff that we were planting into bare dirt, a week and a half, 2 weeks earlier. So it was kind of one of those, we were doing the exact opposite of what everyone said, and we're going to have concrete. And we had the most mellow soil you've ever seen. It was absolutely beautiful. Craziest thing we ever seen. Brian and I were sitting in the cab together, and we were both laughing the entire time we were doing it, because like, how many rules and how many old farmers will be turning over in their grave thinking about what we're doing right now?
Yeah. So, as when you think, Brian, about the system of farming that you started in versus the system of farming that you're in now, and how, like, there is you've lived the transition, but if you were to take those two separate realities and just look at them without looking at the transition, it would appear as if though there is no bridge between the two, like they're on two completely opposite planets.
Absolutely.
And I think this is a struggle for many people who would desire to change, who desire to go through the transition, but they look at the very different, radically 180-degree different system that people like you are implementing, and they say, how do I get there from here? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that. What does the process, what does an effective process look like? How do you get there from where you are?
it's it's a struggle, because the first thing you have to overcome is the mind. The what you have in your head and what you think about farming, and what everyone has taught you and your neighbors do and all that stuff. That's the hardest part to get over, or to under to what's the word am I looking for, to understand that, hey, there is a different way. And when something isn't going quite right, that doesn't mean, just because you think it's not right, doesn't mean that it's not right, because you don't know what the other side of this looks like in 2 weeks from now. And a lot of it, I'd say, that I learned over the years is there's things that I thought were complete failures that ended up being the best scenario I've ever come up with. But when I looked at it from the conventional farming, I thought, wow, there's no way this could work. In every book written by the universities, by whoever, it would never work. This is not farming. This should never work. And then it does. And it leaves you scratching your head going, okay, why did this work? How did this work? And what can I do to mimic this again? And, how can we test this to make sure that it wasn't a phenomenon, or something like that, that it was actual repeatable series of events or scenario.
What are some examples of some of those instances where you thought it was a complete failure or would appear that it has no chance of being successful and it turned out to be?
Vetch. The very first year that I planted vetch, I shouldn't say first year. It was the third year that I planted vetch, trying to roller crimp. Started in 2017, I think it was, is when we started to try to roller crimp. 17 or 18, I can't remember. But we tried to roller crimp, and the 15th of May, I went out and looked at this stuff, and I said, there's no way, absolutely no way. And we disted it under, because the vetch was 10 inches tall, the weeds were there, and it's like, oh, this is going to be a disaster. So we disted it under. The next year, I tried it again, and same thing, 20th of May. We went out there and looked at it, and it's like, this is a loss. It's not going to work. We disted it under, and conventional farmed it organically, conventional tillage, I should say.
I already know
And
where
then the third,
I already know where this story is going because I
yeah,
grew up with my dad growing veg, and it's remarkable what happens after the 20th of May.
yeah. And the third year, the 20th of May, we went out and looked at it and said, it's a loss. It's a complete loss. And the only reason why I didn't get to the field was because I had to unhook the scraper to hook up to the disc, and the disc had a bearing out on the wheel. So I went and I had to get parts. I got parts. I got everything put together. And when I got everything put together, it rained. We got an inch and a half of rain, and we couldn't come back till about the 26th of May. And between the 20th and 26th of May, that stuff went from a foot tall to 3 foot tall. And we looked at it, and my agronomist and I sat there, and it's like, I think we need to give it another week. And we
Yep.
left it till the 1st of June. And I'm telling you what, I did not understand vetch. I did not understand that way of farming. It was a complete shock. And now I say I don't even look at the fields of vetch. If I think I'm going to try to roller crimp it, I don't even want to look at that field till the 25th to 28th of May. That's when I need to make my determination. But when you're talking about the insurance side, I mean, that don't leave much room for that window. You're 10 days from late planting. June, I think, June or May 25th, I think, is our late planting date. Then you have 10 days of late planting, or in that ballpark at least. Um, but yeah, I mean, you're pushing right up against there. But man, when you wait, holy cow, that vetch took over. We had, I would say, all your normal spring weeds out there, but that vetch, it powered past all of them. There was nothing out there but a field of purple. It was absolutely gorgeous when we planted it. It was the most relaxing field I've ever planted in my life because it just floated. Everything worked. It was just, I loved it. It was great.
Those fields that have that much vetch residue on them, I grew up growing vegetables, and vetch was one of our favorite cover crops, and you would have 3 to 4 inches of residue that we
Hmm.
would be incorporating in and plowing in with a team of horses and a moldboard plow. And it's remarkable what that does to a soil profile and how a field changes with that vetch inclusion. So One of the topics we haven't really gotten into is weed control during the season, and of course, uh, particularly the one of the tools that you're using if you're not quote unquote conventional farming it is roller crimping. I'm sure with the years of experience that you've had, you've learned lots of tips and tricks and techniques for roller crimping that are perhaps not as widely understood because I see I get to have conversations with lots of growers who try roller crimping and their mileage varies significantly. And because maybe they don't have the best tool design or they don't know quite how to manage it, they get the timing slightly wrong on the cover crop. It's a process that is fairly knowledge intensive. It's not as easy as going out and spraying Roundup on it. So, what have you learned, and what are some of the opportunities that you see for growers to greatly improve their success with roller crimping?
What I've seen with roller crimping, the biggest thing is patience. In all honesty, that's probably the biggest thing is making sure that the crop that you're going to crimp is ready to crimp. If it's not ready, I don't care if you have $1,000, you know, hunk of iron that you put together to make a roller crimper, or if you have the latest and greatest roller crimper that's on the market, neither one of them are going to work because the cover crop is not ready. You have to make sure that the timing is right. Once the timing is right, then it's a matter of figuring out, and I guess what we have seen, um, we run a double roller crimper, small rolls, high speed, double crimper, versus the kind of I'd say more the industry standard of a larger 16 to 18 inch drum, maybe a 20 to 24 inch drum with a blade on it, or a blunt edge to roller crimp that's in the single where they more rely on weight. I would say in our experience, and this is just us. I'm not going to say this for any other part of the world because I don't know. But for us, a single roller crimper, the normal, like the one that the Rodale Institute, kind of has the drawings of, that works really well in rye in our area. In vetch in our area, that roller crimper does work, but you have to be well over, I would say probably 70-75% bloom before it works as successful as it needs to. Otherwise, you're trying to roll it twice. And when you roll it twice, it seems like you damage and you start pulling up that beautiful mat that you laid down that first time, and you start poking holes in it, and then you start having issues. I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I've done a lot of research over, I'd say, the course of about 4 years, and I spent a lot of time on European websites and watching what they do, just due to the fact that they haven't used chemistries the way that the U.S. has in the past 20, well, honestly, in the past 30 to 35, 40 years. They've got a different way of looking at it. And when it comes to the regenerative side, I'd say, and cover crops, they're probably, I'd say, 15 to 20 years ahead of us in the way that their soils are and the way that their cover crops are and their understanding of cover crops. But when I looked over there, a lot of times they would run smaller rolls, small fields, but they'd run smaller rolls and they would run much higher speeds than what we would be talking about here in the U.S. And they would talk about the tearing and pulling and that of the cover crop, and not just the true crimp of what we talk about here in the United States. So that's why we built our own, and went to a double crimper, smaller rolls, and then increased the speed. We actually decreased the weight, but by decreasing the weight, increasing the speed, and having two rollers side by side or behind each other, it actually started that pulling and tearing. And I guess the way that I kind of look at it is, if you've ever been in the alfalfa industry, a crimper is a crimper. A steel crimper, steel on steel or a steel on rubber, it actually breaks that stem. And that's what you're looking for. With this one, it's more like what I would call like a V-tine conditioner. where it's like a flail shredder, it doesn't actually, it will crimp, it will create that break, but the two rollers working together actually kind of pull and tear at the stems and at the branches of the plant, and actually cause that plant to break down. Not really, I guess I shouldn't say break down, but to get a better kill on it, because you're damaging more of the above ground structure and getting a better crimp and pull on it.
What creates that pulling action? Is it because the two rolls are at different sizes, different diameters? What creates that action?
I no, it's so the front roller, I guess if you think of it's like two 12-inch tires basically. The back of the front roller, from what I've seen driving beside this and when I've flown the drone up as close as I can and actually rode on the machine, it's like the front roller lays it down and crimps it, but then as it comes around and that front roller on the backside actually kind of pulls the crop up just a little bit, well, that second roller is right there. And so as the front one's pulling it up, the back one's beating it right back down. And I think that's where you're getting that little bit of a pull and a tear to it. And this is completely my guess on it, and just kind of looking at it from an engineering stance of that's where I think that is happening. The rollers are exactly the same size, but it's just and the other way I describe it, because one of my neighbors does a lot of rotary hoeing, and he says the difference between a single hoe and a double hoe. He says you can take a rotary hoe across the field one time and it does a good job, but if you take it across the second time, it damages it. It damages the crop. But if you take a double hoe and go across it one time, it does twice the job of a single hoe, but it doesn't damage the crop. And I think it's the same in my mind. It's kind of that same deal of you're not allowing that soil. You're hitting it as more times, but you're doing twice as much in one quick action instead of trying to do it one time and then coming back later, an hour or minutes or days and doing it a second time. I think it's just something where the two roles work together, and it just seems to do it just seems to do a much better action. But the problem with that is we that does a tremendous job in vetch. Vetch and multi-species cover crops, I love the double roller. But now if we want to jump back to a mono species where we're talking like just a single rye crop, it's almost too aggressive for that rye crop because it will actually chop it. And if you know in rye, when you're trying to do that, you don't want to chop it, because if you chop it off, a lot of times it'll regrow, and you don't want that. And we have had some issues with that double roller that it's too aggressive on a rye crop if the rye crop doesn't have the full biomass that you're looking for. If you hit some light spots or something like that, it actually will just chop it up and spit it out the back of it. It's too aggressive on that side. But
So as you've developed and built and engineered your own roller crimper, what is the current roller diameter, and have you changed the chevron design, or have you changed the crimpers in any way at all?
um, we we started out with a 6-inch tube and with a 4-inch, what I'd call a 4-inch flute, a 4-inch blade. Then we went to an 8-inch tube with a 3-inch flute, basically the same size, just increased the size of the tube because we're having bearing issues. Now we've got a different bearing that we're trying. We're on, I don't know, generation 4 of it. A different bearing that we're trying to use, which actually allowed us to go back down to a 3-inch tube, or excuse me, a 6-inch tube. But then with a 3-inch flute to try to actually go smaller than what our original one was, because the 3-inch flute or the 3-inch blade actually seems to work better than the 4-inch, and we don't have as much bending. We don't have rocks in our area, but the ground does get a little hard, and we do have some concrete chunks here and there. But we seem to have not as much damage on a 3-inch blade as what we do on a 4-inch. And it's just a piece of 1/4 inch mild steel. It's nothing. It's nothing crazy or special. It's just a piece of steel. Um, as far as the pattern, ours is just a 2 foot long blade, and we just stagger them around 2 foot. The two blades kind of work together. There's two blades on one bracket,
So
and
are
then
they straight across, parallel with the shaft, or are they angled across the
they are
surface?
angled. They are
Yeah.
angled. We set them back. And it's highly scientific. It's about a finger width underneath each end of the blade is what we do. I've got a jig for it that it's more scientific than that. But when we played with it the very first time, I set some more aggressive, less aggressive. Obviously, you can't go straight because it just it chops something terrible, and you can't ride it. But it seems like it seems to work okay, and it's just a straight blade. It's nothing crazy.
And as you've experimented with the smaller diameters, one of the key pieces that you mentioned was going with a higher ground speed as well. How has your ground speed shifted compared to the original design that you were working with?
The original design that we had, I would say, is a 5 to 7 mile an hour tops, and that's one that you can add water into the drum, that sort of stuff, to add more weight. And honestly, what we found with it is the slower you ran, the more weight, the better it did. But when you got faster, it's like you couldn't get enough weight on it, and it almost wanted to ride up on the crop. I'd say like a boat on a wake. The faster you went, it just kind of rode up on top of the crop, and it just seemed like we didn't get that good of a kill if we pushed much over that I'd say 5 to 6 mile an hour. It just didn't want to. It didn't want to do it. Now, in comparison to our smaller rollers, I would say our bottom speed is 7 to 8 mile an hour. And I've went through on some, we've got a couple of fields that are just tabletop flat, and they are smooth sailing. And I've pushed it as high as 14, 15 mile an hour. And honestly, I don't know if there is a top end other than the
Wow.
fact that it's just kind of scary when you look down and you see iron flying around that fast, that close to you. So, yeah, it makes you really think about all your welding skills and all that. I wonder what would happen if one of those would fly off right now. So, but yeah, it just seems like the higher the speed, the better, and the heavier the cover crop, the faster the speed, the better the job it did. So it's a I don't know. It's one of those that it's kind of out of my mind and out of my realm of thinking of why it is that way and why it works that way. And I wish I had more time to spend with that crimper, but with managing this farm and doing everything else, it's kind of one of those things that's kind of taken the wayside. And right now I'm trying to put the crimpers back together at night and make a new bearing holder and everything else in our machine shop. But it's one of those when you have all the design and the everything in your head, and it's I know what I want it to look like, but it's hard for me to describe that, and I don't have the CAD system to put it on there to make a 3D part of it. So it's kind of trial and error. It's a little expensive at times. So
Aside from your experience with hairy vetch, what were some other experiences where things you expected to be a complete failure turned out to be a very valuable learning experience?
corn into alfalfa. That was that was one that I always looked at that. I love the vetch, but the biggest issue for us is just getting it, established. You're locked into a rotation where you have to have a cereal grain, or a summer producing crop so that you can get that vetch in time. And I always looked at that's the stepping stone to a permanent cover crop. And the one of the best cover crops in our area, and that's why I went back to my days of putting up hay in the early 2000s, is alfalfa would choke out absolutely anything. There was nothing that could compete with alfalfa. So we had a couple of quarters of alfalfa, and we started playing with planting corn into them, into a living crop. We tried multiple different ways of roller crimping and like what Rick Clark has done in the past of out in Illinois, where Illinois Indiana area of roller crimping it. We tried flaming it. We've tried cutting it off and just letting it lay on the soil. We've tried cutting it off and green chopping it. Tried a little bit of everything. I can tell you the one thing you don't do is just plant it and let it go, because it will overtake a corn crop. There's no doubt about that. Um, but we've tried a lot of different things with it, and every one of them is successful in its own way. And I'd say the roller crimping is probably the most successful of all of it. But we've also done some green chopping that I'd love to do more research with, of planting the corn and then allowing the corn to actually come up, and then chop it off when that corn's basically it. And I won't say a stage, because stages don't work when you're living in cover crops. You got to go by crop height. But when that corn's about 1.5 to 2 inches tall, we went out and cut it off. And if we had a way of cutting it off, windrowing it, and coming through with a green chop immediately right after that, that corn took off from there. And my goodness, that was probably our best results. But when you look at the equipment, which is the other struggle to what it is that what we're trying to do, you can't just have a 25 chopper trucks and choppers driving across your cornfield. Then it comes into, okay, well, are you going to do a tram line? And do you want to pull a trailer instead of having trucks come alongside? And it becomes a whole nother lineup of equipment that you don't have. And how do you make that work? Because that's not readily made equipment. That I need a chopper that runs on 90-inch centers, and a wagon that runs on 90-inch centers, and then I need trucks to haul it away. Or what do I do with the alfalfa once I take it off? And it's kind of that snowball effect when you get down to it.
Yeah. So what has the roller crimping of the alfalfa been looking like, and how has that been working for you? I'm assuming you're going in that direction more on more acres rather than the green chop.
Yeah, the roller crimping is the best, as far as I would say the best for the simplicity's sake. Now, the one thing that Rick and I have sat down and talked multiple times is, Rick has a good chance when he does this, he actually kills the alfalfa, and we have not. I cannot kill the alfalfa with a roller crimper. Now, excuse me, maybe that's the difference in roller crimpers there, where he's using a single crimp and I'm using the double crimp again. Or I think it's also some of the fact that Rick runs 20-inch rows where we run 30-inch rows. So I think it might have something to do with the canopy, the
Shading it out
quickness of the
much more quickly.
canopy.
Yep.
Yep. So there's more research to be done there. And I've talked with the Rodale Institute. I've talked with Aaron Sylvia on this, and a lot of different people of trying to understand why we get results one way and results another way. And I've actually spoke with a couple of seed producers on for alfalfa, saying, "Hey, do you have a variety that's laying in the back of the warehouse that doesn't like the heat of summer? That produces a tremendous first cutting, and then it kind of goes dormant all summer during the heat. Just grows 4 or 5 inches tall and hangs out, and then in the fall it comes back on strong, so that you'd have a nice cover crop. Or if a guy wanted to do some fall grazing or something like that in those corn stalks, because we've actually baled off the alfalfa and corn stalks when we got all said and done, because we were afraid it was going to choke out the alfalfa, because there was so much residue out there. So we baled it off. And I mean to tell you, as far as cow hay, that was some of the best cow hay, and the guys went absolutely crazy over it. because it was about a 50-50 blend of alfalfa and corn stalks. And the cows would lick the ground clean wherever you put them out because it had everything that they were looking for.
Wow. Wow. I had another question for you, Brian, but what you just said completely took my mind away from the question that I had a moment ago. I was going to comment on I think your question on asking the seed breeders for alfalfa varieties is the right question to ask because I've been intrigued by uh, other researchers who I've heard these stories of people who have been trying intercropping alfalfa or using interseeding alfalfa into a cereal crop as a nurse crop. And we tend to think of alfalfa as alfalfa or red clover as red clover, but they're actually observing that there are specific varieties that have a completely different influence on the cereal crop that they are being planted with. And that we shouldn't think of these different varieties as being one universal species and expect them to all respond the same way. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us there to do. There's a lot more homework. As you said, the Europeans in some ways are a decade plus ahead of us because they have been looking at specific varieties and influences and interactions between specific species and specific varieties to a much greater degree than we have been. There's a lot of opportunity for us there.
I completely agree. I always said that I hope that by the time I get out of this game, that I can understand when I look at a soil test or look at a soil conditions and that sort of stuff, that I can look at the varieties of cover crops that are there and say, you need to look at this, and this, and not saying it as a rye, as a legume, or a alfalfa, or this, and more of you need to look at this specific variety because that variety does what it is that your soil needs or what it is that you're looking for. It's kind of like, I guess, same way we have corn and soybeans. They know what soil type it does best in. They know every aspect about that corn, that soybean, that cereal, whatever. They understand that very well. But when we talk about cover crops, it's, oh yeah, we got some seed left in the bin. There's just not that there's not that push to understand those cover crops and the varieties of cover crops that we have. And I really think that that's I really wish there was a lot more push into that. The problem is I know everything's pushed with money, and there isn't a lot of money in that side of cover crops, because unfortunately that goes against the retail ag side of selling chemistries and fertilizer. So I understand it, but at the same time, it's I guess maybe that's where some private money needs to get invested and actually do the research on the cover crops and develop them more. It, I know we've been working with it, but it's kind of hard to do on your own when you feel like you're the lone man out here trying to do it on your own. So
Yep. So, Brian, what comes next for you in the sense of as you see your farming system continuing to evolve and constantly learning new things, where do you see the areas of opportunity that you'd like to see your operation evolve and become better in the future?
what I'm looking at, obviously taking over this management role, it's kind of changed my focus. Um, and now I feel like I'm not as focused on the day-to-day operations of out in the field, but I can actually focus more on these types of things, these projects that on my own soil, on my own ground, that I can do I can do more experimenting, and I can spend more time with those smaller areas and develop it. With those plots, I really want to spend more time with the alfalfa and understand that more, because I think a lot of the alfalfa is timing of planting versus when like the alfalfa is at a certain stage, and roller crimping at different stages. Whether it's full bloom or partial bloom, seed set, whatever that is, and then working more with the different varieties. That's in my mind, it's not so much of growing crops anymore. I really want to try to focus more on how do we how do we produce everything that we need for that growing crop, because the growing a crop, I mean, unfortunately, isn't hard to do. You can go about anywhere and get the rules on how to raise a corn crop or a soybean crop, but in the way that we're trying to do it with, being regenerative and sustainable and having everything right there on the farm and allowing the farm to produce it for itself. Um, I think there's just so much more to learn there, and that's what I really want to focus on, and learn what my soil is actually telling me instead of guessing. I mean, in a way, I kind of feel like I do a lot of guessing at the end of the day when you're looking at, you look at the soil test, the Haney test, the whatever it is, the kind of a analysis that you're running. But at the end of the day, do any of us actually understand what those numbers mean? Because for every soil type, and for field A versus field Z, you could look at the same soil test and have two completely different problems, but when you look at it on paper, it might look like it's the same problem.
Exactly.
So I really think there's more research that needs to be done in understanding the soil structure and what's actually going on in the soil, instead of looking at a piece of paper and saying, "Oh, this is what you need."
Yep. Yeah, I think there was a very good reason why agronomy has been defined in terms of chemistry for the last century, and being the very simple reason that that was the one thing we could easily measure. But that has really led us astray in some very crucial ways, and I'm really
Hmm.
optimistic about some of the new science taking us in different directions. Brian, one of the questions that comes to my mind, I've been, I have this, I don't know quite how to describe it, this personal experience where I repeatedly I have conversations with people where things that appear to be very obvious to me, or that appear to be very simple or intuitive, like it's just, yeah, it's obvious, it's the way it is, are none obvious to other people. And or things that appear to be very easy and simple to me appear to be very complex for other people. What are those pieces for you? What are questions that you get asked? What are the things that to other people that you perceive other people see as being very difficult or complex to achieve, and yet seem to be very easy for you?
It's a good question. I have a lot of things that I could say to that, but some of them I probably should keep to myself. Uh, but
Well, why start that now? Why start the self censoring now?
well, there might be some people listening that I should probably keep some comments to myself. So, um, it's I would say the biggest thing is, uh, the simple one to point out is cover crops. You look at cover crops, and in our area where we talk about irrigation, we live and breathe and die because of irrigation. Uh, a lot of people will say, well, we can't afford to plant cover crops because they take too much moisture. And I'm on the other spectrum of that, saying I've planted cover crops, and yes, it takes more moisture, but it doesn't take more moisture at the end of the year. Throughout the entire year, it takes more moisture at different times of the year. So, like right now, today, we're watering cover crops. Right now, it's the 23rd of April, and we've been watering cover crops for about 15-20 days. Where everybody else, the pivots are parked, and they're saying, well, the argument is going to be at the coffee shop that, well, they're going to pump twice as many inches on this year as what we're going to. No, we're not, because we're pumping water into the profile. It's not running off. Our cover crop is utilizing some of that moisture, but when we lay down that cover crop, or if, in some cases where we work that cover crop back into the soil, all that green manure back into the soil, our water holding capabilities are through the roof comparison to the quote no till conventional tillage. We've seen our infiltration rates the last 5, 6 years. I would say I don't think triples even close, quadruple, maybe even more. Years ago, I would say for us, 60 to 70 hundredths was a pretty good circle for a pivot, and you might see a little water running out the end. Today, this last fall and the fall before, we did some tests. I slowed a pivot down and was dumping on 2.5 inches and had zero runoff. Now, obviously, we are in a drought, but we watered all summer long, and we were just doing some testing at the end of the year as to in a normal year. I would say the water here, we kind of seal over the soil when we irrigate all summer, and the water doesn't want to infiltrate into it. And now we don't have that problem. We can turn on the pivot, and I can run a pivot as slow as I want to run it, and the water goes in. I pay attention, I guess, when we have our rainfalls. It seems like we get them in 3 inch increments, in 20 minutes. But I pay very close attention as to what my fields look like and what my neighbors' fields look like. I've got one that is directly upstream from me, and it's an 18-inch tube that runs from his side of the road to my side of the road on half of his farm, and a 24-inch tube that runs on the other side of the farm. So they're about a quarter of a mile apart. The one that's an 18-inch tube runs a quarter of a mile before it runs out of my farm. The one that's a 24-inch tube runs just a little under a half of a mile before it runs off of my farm. We had a 375 rainfall it was last fall. The water came onto my farm but never left.
Wow.
The cover crop was there, and it just fell away. We had this past winter, I'm sorry, it wasn't this past winter, it was the winter prior, between 22 and 23. We had about a 10-inch snowfall, and the ground was froze. But we had the bare ground was froze. We had a heavy cover crop on, and our soil was froze on top, but it wasn't froze deep. And I watched. It was in March, April, February, March of 23. I watched all the snow melt off of that quarter of ground and come onto ours, and I was literally watching from my shop how far the water was running onto my farm before it would disappear. I drained off. I think there's about, I'd say, 120 acres of his farm drains into those two tubes and comes across of 10 inches of snow, and he had corn stalks on there. So the corn stalks were full. It never got more than 300 feet out into my field, and it just soaked away. And everything that was laying out in our field soaked away because we actually have to pool about 6 inches of water before it runs across the road into one of our other fields. And we never had water run across that entire spring. We never had water run across the road. Now we did have one flood event that water did come across the road, but it came across the road from the southern side of my field, not from the quarter that I'm talking about that was to the north side of the field. So it was just kind of interesting to me as to how we can absorb so much more moisture than what the neighbors can in the conventional farming. And to me, that speaks volumes of what it is that we're doing. But to them, and I shouldn't say to them, but to the normal person, the normal farmer, they'd look at that and say, well, that cover crop's taking up that much moisture. Well, no, it's not. It's the exact opposite. And, so I'd say as far as common knowledge, for us that have been in this side of it, no, it does take more water at different times of the year. But during the peak and the heat of the season, if you let that lay on top of there when you roller crimp it and let that mat lay there, you don't need the summer, to pump all summer long. When the wind's blowing 50 mile an hour, we don't have to pump, because you have that reserve there.
You've mulched the soil effectively. You're
Hmm.
not losing moisture from the soil surface. You have better infiltration rates. You have better water percolation in the soil profile. The list of all the various contributing factors is a long list, but the net effect is that you have a much greater reserve of water that lasts in the soil profile. You're not losing it and you're not vaporizing it constantly.
Hmm. You don't have, in our biggest issue in our area here in Nebraska, and I don't think it's measured appropriately, is sun and wind evaporation in corn and soybeans. When you chemically kill everything, and they say, well, the ground is covered because you look out there and you have a green mat, but the amount of sunshine that gets down into that soil or gets to the soil layer, and then the wind that blows here, and I mean, it blows every single day. It seems like it's getting worse and worse. But I don't think the true value of what we lose to Mother Nature in wind and sunshine and that evaporation of those top couple inches, when they're covered, that's pretty much zero. There's When there's a cover crop laying down there, soil temps, I'd say soil temps very seldom ever reach 90 degrees. They probably stay in the high 70s to low 80s all summer long. And I know we did tests on when we were doing our high population corn on 20-inch twin rows or 10-inch rows. We went out and did soil temp studies. And in 30-inch rows, the soil temp was 103 degrees in the middle of the afternoon on a 30-inch row. And in our dense canopy it was on about the 20th of July when we did this. And on our dense canopy, we were 82 degrees. And we did the same thing in our cover crops on 30-inch rows versus a 30-inch row with no cover crop mat out there. And we had the exact same results. High 70s, low 80s on a 100-degree day. And, they say corn shuts down and quits, growing throughout the day when the canopy temperature gets above that, 85 to 87 degrees or something like that. The corn shuts down. Well, we've laid thermometers when it's 105, 106 degrees outside, our hottest days, and with that cool canopy of that mat down below, we're still setting a canopy temperature right at that 85 to 86 degrees, versus the chemically killed fields or might be 100, they might be 105, the same temperature as the air temperature. And when it cools down in the evening, that unfortunately that corn crop's going to hold in that heat, and we cool down almost immediately comparison to where there's no cover out there. It holds that heat in there, and that corn doesn't cool off.
Brian, that's such an obvious point, but I never thought of it in quite that way. I mean, I've thought and talked a great deal about the importance of soil temperatures and keeping soil temperatures cool to have continuous biological populations, continual release of nutrients. But I never connected the dots quite that directly to canopy temperature, and yet it's so obvious. You have the exact same heat island effect as you would in a city where it's all asphalt and pavement and concrete, and it's serving as a heat sink. It's dark in color, it's absorbing the sunlight's energy and then radiating it out again, where you have the strong heat island effect. And you have the same thing with bare soil, which is going to affect the crop's photosynthetic ability. It's like such a so obvious. It's like, wow, why did I never think of that?
Well, and my agronomist and I, we've sat in many snowstorms or just really crappy days, sat in the office and tried to solve all the world's problems, like you do in the wintertime with farmers. Um, and he and I have talked about it multiple times, and I think that in those scenarios, one of the things that we've come up with is when we talk about planting dates and planting later, but we're planting into those types of environments. You look at the GDUs of a crop in a conventional world where we just talk about those canopy temperatures reaching above 90 day after day after day. Well, that corn shuts down and is not, those GDUs are there, but the corn can't utilize them. Where in our sense, where that canopy
Exactly.
temperature stays lower, we're still utilizing those GDUs, and I think it's definitely measurable, but I don't, that's why I say that for us, we've planted corn in June that's 110-day corn that should be planted, the 15th of May at the latest. And we're harvesting the exact same time that our neighbors are harvesting, when they're planting corn in the latter part of April, and they're planting 110-day corn too. Same varieties, except ours are non-GMO or organic versus theirs are GMO. But the same varieties from the same companies, but we're harvesting at the same time. And I think it's just in those scenarios, I think we're just more efficient with the cover crops and having that living residue or that dead residue on the ground, that it can hold that temperature down, and we can better utilize those GDUs and actually progress a crop faster throughout the summer.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I would guess that there's probably a parallel effect where there is the effect of the cooler crop temperatures, because one of the things that I've observed paying a lot of attention to corn yield trials and experiences all across the Midwest is that usually the highest yielding regions or the highest yielding years are years when we have cool nights during grain fill. So there definitely is
Mm-hmm.
this strong component of nighttime cool down on the plant itself, but that also has an effect on the soil biology, both directly. There's kind of this two-pronged effect. So one is when you keep the soil cool from your mulching effect, then that translates to better nutrient delivery, which gives you the capacity for greater yields, but also to the point that you're making, as you have this cooler canopy, that's going to translate to increased photosynthesis, more sugar production, which is going to translate to more sugars out through the root system as root exudates. So you have this self-perpetuating cycle where you are allowing the plants to gain a lot more energy both in the form of nutrients from the soil as well as photosynthates, simply from keeping the whole ecosystem cooler.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I think there's definitely something there. Now the problem is how do you go about proving that, and putting that into words and paper, because in my mind that comes right back to the insurance talk that we had about later planting dates.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a calendar deal for them. I think it's the practice. These are your planting dates if this is your practice. But if this is your practice, then these are your planting dates. I think that's really where it needs to go, or what it needs to be looked at, because, um, you know, if you're doing it one way or doing it a different way, you have totally different scenarios. It's not a cut and dried, A versus B. It's a totally different scenario.
Exactly. It comes back to the comment that I made earlier is that if you look at your current system versus the system that many people are familiar with, it almost appears as if there is no bridge between the worlds because they are two completely different management systems. It's you happen
Yep.
to be growing corn and that plant looks the same, but that's about the only similarity.
That's true. That is most definitely true.
Yeah. Wonderful. This has been a very enjoyable conversation, Brian. I've really enjoyed having you on, and I know with the decade plus of experience that you have with this different system, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of all the possible topics we could talk about and the things that we have that you have learned. And so I would invite all of our listeners, if you get the opportunity to run into Brian at an event, have a conversation with him sometime, I think you will find it very enlightening and rewarding. So I want to say thank you for being here and for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and for all the great work that you do. I really appreciate everything that you do and the many people that you've helped out.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it. It's one of those, I always feel that this is a conversation that I'll never tell you what to do right. I'll just tell you that there's a few things I wouldn't try because they may or may not work out very well for you. So, yep.
All right. Thank you, Brian. The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.